Windermere House wore its winter afternoon like a perfectly judged accessory, the pale light caught and softened by tall panes that had witnessed 3 centuries of such gatherings. The music room had been coaxed, with a minimum of fuss, into a rehearsal space for Lady Windermere's charitable pageant. A small dais, skirted in damask, stood before the fireplace where 2 silver altar candles, lifted for the purpose from the private chapel, held court with unwavering flames. Their ecclesiastical dignity seemed undiminished by theatrical service, if anything enhanced by the temporary elevation from sacred to social purpose. Lady Windermere presided from a gilt chair whose position had not been left to chance, her silver hair as immaculate as her authority was absolute. Her pale eyes, sharp as winter light, registered every nuance of the proceedings with the practised attention of one accustomed to command. The occasion was the final rehearsal of the Triumph of Candlemas, a modest entertainment designed to fund the village church roof, though the assembled company suggested motives more complex than mere charity. Miss Helen Dacre moved between the candles with the calculated grace of someone who had never doubted her right to centre stage. Her rehearsal dress of cream silk promised the flowing robes of tomorrow's performance, and even in practice, she carried herself with proprietorial authority. When she spoke her lines, "Hail, purest fire, illuminate our darkness," each syllable emerged with a precision that made the words seem both reverent and somehow possessive. "Again, if you please, Helena," requested Mr. Felix Marlowe, whose London theatrical experience had earned him the deference of the local company. His voice carried that particular blend of authority and diplomacy essential to managing amateur performers of strong personality and stronger social position. The veil must suggest mystery without obscuring the voice entirely. Helena inclined her head with the steel-wrapped courtesy of one for whom obliging had become a refined art. Near the improvised wings, Miss Celia Ashford watched with an expression that mingled dutiful attention with barely concealed anxiety. At 22, Lady Windermere's niece possessed the sort of fresh beauty that suggested morning light on water, yet her role as the spirit of dawn seemed to cause her considerable strain. Each time Helena performed her entrance, Celia's hands tightened imperceptibly, and her eyes followed the older woman's movements with the intensity of a student studying a particularly difficult lesson. "Miss Celia," called Felix gently, "your cue approaches. Let the light find you rather than you finding the light." Celia's glance flickered to the silver candles as if they held answers to questions she dared not voice aloud. She took her position with the careful grace of someone conscious of being observed by those whose opinions carried social weight. "By the French windows, sir." Julian Thornfield stood with the easy authority of a man accustomed to command, his military bearing evident despite civilian tweeds. Beside him, Mr. Basil Thorne sketched with quick, angular strokes, his artist eye capturing not merely the physical arrangement but something of the psychological tensions that hummed beneath the surface courtesy. Mr. Quill, Lady Windermere's butler, moved through the room with the invisible efficiency that marked 30 years of superior service. His trained eye noted everything, the way Helena's fingers lingered on the silver candlestick, the almost imperceptible tightening around Celia's eyes when she thought herself unobserved, the minute adjustments that spoke of familiarity with valuable objects. Miss Edith Laffan, the secretary, maintained her customary position slightly apart, her notebook ready, and her plain tweeds rendering her nearly invisible, a quality that served her well in managing both correspondence and observation. Dr. Marcus Pell arrived late from his village rounds, bringing with him the faint scent of carbolic and the quiet authority of one who dealt daily with life and death. "The chapel candles are rather magnificent," he observed, his eyes taking in the theatrical arrangement. "Though I trust they're properly secured. Silver of that quality has been known to attract unwelcome attention." Lady Windermere's smile remained perfectly composed, though her eyes sharpened slightly. "My dear Dr. Pell, Windermere's security has been adequate for 3 centuries. I hardly think a charity pageant will strain our defences." "Of course not," Dr. Pell replied with the mildness of milk. "Though one does hear stories. One always hears stories in the country, doesn't one?" The exchange, seemingly casual, left a small silence in its wake. Helena used the moment to adjust her position near the candles, her movements suggesting a familiarity that spoke of more than mere theatrical necessity. Only Miss Laffan seemed to notice when Mr. Quill's glance lingered on the silver flames with something approaching concern and she made a small notation without looking down. As afternoon light began to fade, casting longer shadows across the improvised stage, the silver candles caught the dying light at every angle. Their flames remained steady and bright against the gathering dusk, drawing the eye with magnetic insistence. The rehearsal continued with the serene labour that marks such afternoons. A correction here, a diplomatic adjustment there, the minute negotiations required to maintain harmony among personalities accustomed to deference. "Tomorrow evening," Lady Windermere announced with satisfaction, "we shall give the county quite a creditable performance. The bishop has promised to attend, and I understand several families from London are expected." Her words carried the weight of social triumph, but in the silence that followed, the silver candles seemed to flicker with significance that had nothing to do with theatrical success. In the growing shadows of Windermere's music room, beneath the polished surface of county society's charitable endeavours, something more complex than mere amateur dramatics was beginning to unfold. The candles burned on, each holding in its flame the precise measure of attention it required, while the assembled company maintained their careful positions in a drama whose true nature remained, for the moment, as veiled as Helena's mysterious spirit. The rehearsal dissolved with the particular quietude that follows amateur theatrical endeavour, not the sharp conclusion of professional performance, but a gentle subsidence into ordinary evening. Lady Windermere departed with a final encompassing nod that managed to convey both approval and dismissal, her presence leaving behind that subtle vacuum which always attended her withdrawal from any gathering. Felix Marlowe gathered his notes with the weary satisfaction of one who has shepherded artistic temperament through another successful afternoon, while Sir Julian lingered to discuss tomorrow's lighting arrangements with the measured precision he brought to all practical matters. Miss Celia Ashford slipped away with the ethereal quality that seemed her natural element, her pale evening dress making her appear almost spectral in the gathering dusk. Mr. Basil Thorne packed his sketching materials with deliberate care, his artist's eye making one final assessment of the scene before surrendering it to darkness. One by one, the music room emptied, leaving behind only the lingering scent of beeswax, old wood, and that indefinable essence of human endeavour recently concluded. It was Mr. Quill who found her, as perhaps it was inevitable he should. His evening duties included a final survey of any room that had hosted the day's activities, a meticulous ritual of restoration that had served Windermere through decades of social gatherings. He moved through the music room with his customary silent efficiency, straightening a cushion here, closing a window against the November chill there, his trained eye noting and correcting the small disarrangements that marked human occupation. His attention was drawn, as it naturally would be, to the 2 silver candles still burning upon their dais. Such valuable objects could not be left unattended through the night, their precious wax wasting in solitary flame. As he approached the small platform, something in the arrangement of shadows caught his practised eye, a fold of cream silk that seemed too deliberately still, too perfectly positioned against the dark velvet backdrop. Miss Helena Dacre sat in the gilt chair she had occupied during rehearsal, her head tilted back against the high carved rest with an almost regal composure. Her silver-streaked hair caught the candlelight with its customary elegance, and her hands lay folded in her lap with the precise arrangement she had always brought to her theatrical poses. Only the absolute stillness of her form and the way the flickering flames cast no answering movement across her features suggested that this was not merely an actress taking momentary rest between performances. Quill approached with the careful deliberation that 30 years of service had taught him. He did not call her name. Something in the quality of her stillness forbade such presumption. Instead, he observed with the trained attention he brought to all matters requiring delicate assessment. Her face turned slightly toward the nearer candle, wore an expression of faint surprise, as if she had been interrupted in the midst of some important consideration. Her lips, which had delivered her lines with such precise authority only hours before, were slightly parted, and there was about her entire attitude a quality of listening, as if she attended to some sound beyond the range of ordinary hearing. It was then that Quill noticed the silver candlestick nearest to her chair had been moved from its original position. The base, he observed with growing unease, bore a small dark stain that had not been present during the afternoon's rehearsal. Miss Dacre's right hand, which lay so precisely folded over her left, showed the faintest discoloration about the fingertips, and there was upon the air a scent that had nothing to do with beeswax or old wood. something faintly metallic, almost medicinal, that spoke to senses trained by years of careful household management. He did not touch her. His instincts, honed by decades of discretion, warned him that this scene required preservation rather than intervention. Instead, he withdrew with the same measured pace that had brought him forward, his mind already calculating the proper sequence of notifications that such a discovery demanded. Dr. Pell, summoned from the drawing-room where he had been enjoying Lady Windermere's excellent port, arrived within minutes. His medical training asserted itself immediately as he approached the still figure with professional composure. A brief examination confirmed what Quill's experienced eye had already discerned. Miss Helena Dacre was beyond the reach of earthly assistance. "The silver," Dr. Pell murmured, his attention drawn to the stained candlestick base. "Someone has been remarkably clever. The metal would conduct heat efficiently, and certain substances when heated produce vapours that—" He paused, glancing at Quill's attentive face. "I shall need to examine this more thoroughly, but I suspect we are dealing with something far more sophisticated than mere accident." Lady Windermere received the news with the composed dignity that had carried her through 3 decades of social leadership. Her pale eyes registered the information without flinching, though her hands, clasped before her, betrayed the slightest tremor. "The authorities must be notified immediately," she said with quiet authority. "And our guests must be informed that tomorrow's performance will, naturally, be postponed." Miss Lefan, summoned to manage the practical arrangements, moved with her customary efficiency despite the unprecedented nature of her task. The other members of the company gathered in the drawing-room received the news with the subdued shock appropriate to their station. Sir Julian's military bearing stiffened perceptibly, while Felix Marlowe stood frozen in an attitude of theatrical disbelief, as if Helena might yet make her entrance from the wings. Young Celia Ashford, already pale from the evening's nervous strain, seemed to grow almost translucent at the news. She was so looking forward to tomorrow, she whispered, her voice carrying across the room's careful silence. She said it would be her most important performance. The silver candles continued to burn in the music room, their flames steady and unwavering, casting light across the scene with the same ecclesiastical dignity they had brought to the afternoon's rehearsal. Someone had taken considerable care in their arrangement and in the precise positioning of all elements in this final, terrible tableau. The stage was set, the principal player had made her exit, and the mystery of Helena Dacre's death lay waiting in the shadows cast by those 2 faithful flames. In the growing darkness beyond Windermere's windows, the village lights twinkled with their usual peaceful regularity, unaware that their quiet corner of England would soon draw the attention of Scotland Yard, and that their charitable theatrical evening had become the setting for a drama far more complex and sinister than any they had intended to perform. Inspector Roderick Alleyn arrived at Windermere House as the November evening settled into that particular quality of winter stillness that seemed to amplify every sound while muffling every disturbance. The frost had begun its quiet work on the gravel drive, and his motorcar's approach carried the restrained authority of official business conducted with appropriate discretion. The house itself, its Jacobean facade softened by the glow of interior lights, maintained that air of undisturbed elegance which had weathered 3 centuries of human drama with undiminished dignity. Mr. Quill appeared at the door with the silent efficiency that had marked his discovery of the tragedy, his bow conceding nothing to melodrama while acknowledging everything to necessity. The hall beyond contained the measured murmurs of a household that had met calamity and elected to remain upright, the small adjustments of people who had rehearsed for decades the movements of restraint. There were no crowded doorways, no theatrical displays of distress, only the subtle signs of shock that revealed themselves to trained observation in the tightening around eyes, the careful modulation of voices, the way hands sought familiar objects for comfort. Lady Windermere received him in the morning room with that composure which had navigated 3 decades of county society, through various crises. She wore charcoal rather than black, not yet mourning, but that particular shade which suggested appropriate gravity without premature assumption. Her handshake was firm, her voice steady as she made the necessary introductions, though Alan's practised eye caught the slight tension around her eyes that spoke of a night without sleep. "Inspector Alleyn," she said, with the courtesy that had never failed her, "I trust Dr. Pell has provided you with the essential details, Miss Dacre was discovered in the music room at approximately 9:30 yesterday evening. She had remained behind after our rehearsal, though no one recalls seeing her after the general departure. Alleyn's response carried that blend of professional sympathy and quiet authority which had served him well in similar circumstances among England's upper classes. "I'm grateful for your cooperation, Lady Windermere. I understand this must be particularly distressing given the nature of your charitable performance." The music room, when he entered it, held that quality of suspended animation which follows violent disruption of ordinary life. The silver candles had been extinguished, but their presence dominated the space with ecclesiastical dignity, their polished surfaces catching the morning light with an almost magnetic insistence. Miss Dacre's body had been removed, yet the gilt chair remained positioned with mathematical precision, and the entire scene retained the ghostly imprint of tragedy, conducted with remarkable restraint. Alleyn moved through the space with the methodical attention of one who understood that rooms could speak as eloquently as witnesses. He observed the positioning of furniture, the arrangement of rehearsal props, the way light fell across the improvised stage. His hands, long and sensitive, touched nothing, yet seemed to register every detail through some form of tactile observation that required no physical contact. He stood just inside the threshold and let the room, like a conscientious witness, speak before he asked it questions. The carpet took light dimly, showing no signs of struggle or hasty movement. The damask skirting of the dais held soft shadows that told him there had been no rough traffic, no desperate flight or pursuit. A gilt chair of obvious quality had been positioned with exactness upon the small platform, yet its front leg made a mark that did not align with the usual pattern of use. Someone had adjusted it, not to the line of the rug but to something else, to the candle perhaps. He approached the silver candlesticks with the reverence their ecclesiastical origin demanded. The base of the nearer one bore a faint dark stain that had not been present during the afternoon's rehearsal, and there was about its positioning a subtle displacement from the original arrangement. Someone had moved it the smallest degree toward where the chair now stood, creating a relationship between objects that spoke of careful calculation rather than chance. "The candlesticks were borrowed from your chapel, Lady Windermere?" Alleyn inquired, without turning from his examination. "Yes, Inspector. They have been in the family chapel for perhaps 2 centuries, used only for the most significant occasions. Miss Dacre felt they would provide the proper dignity for her entrance as the Spirit of Light." Alleyn nodded, his attention caught by the minute stippling at the candlestick's base. Something darker than beeswax, more purposeful than accidental spillage. The faintest medicinal scent still hung in the air, not bitter, not sweet, but possessing that clinical quality which spoke of substances foreign to the ordinary paraphernalia of great houses. Dr. Pell, who had withdrawn to the shadows near the mantel with the discretion good physicians show when another's expertise takes precedence, stepped forward at Alleyn's glance. "The substance appears to have been applied to the silver base and activated by the candle's heat," he explained with professional precision. "The vapour would have been both swift and relatively painless, almost elegant in its efficiency." "Elegant, yes," Alleyn murmured, his gaze returning to the chair where Helena Dacre had been found, and requiring intimate knowledge of both chemistry and Miss Dacre's habits. Someone who understood her tendency to linger, to perfect her performance through solitary rehearsal. He walked once around the room, allowing it to settle in his mind as a diagram of habits and intentions. On the sideboard, he noted the snuffers that Mr. Quill had not yet employed, a folded handkerchief with stitched initials, a small spray of bay left from the afternoon's arrangements. At the edge of the dais, caught in the damask fringe, was a thread of gauze, the sort that theatrical veils shed when handled with less than perfect care. The assembled company, gathered in the drawing-room for what they understood would be preliminary interviews, presented a study in controlled anxiety. Sir Julian maintained his military bearing despite obvious distress, while Felix Marlowe seemed caught between genuine grief and professional concern for his disrupted production. Young Celia Ashford sat pale and still, her hands folded in unconscious mimicry of her deceased colleague's final pose. Alleyn's manner, when he addressed them, lent the proceedings a new gravity without descending into melodrama. He did not immediately question, but observed, and they, being English and well-bred, read in his quiet attention both the formality of official inquiry and the postponement of whatever relief speech might bring. "Thank you all for remaining available," he said, with that courtesy which acknowledged their cooperation as a choice rather than an obligation. "I shall need to speak with each of you individually, but first, may I ask, was it Miss Dacre's custom to remain behind after rehearsals?" The question, seemingly casual, drew various responses that revealed as much in their hesitations as in their words. Miss Lafan, with her secretary's precision, confirmed that Helena often lingered to perfect particular moments. Felix nodded with the weary recognition of one who had managed many such temperamental perfectionists. Only Celia seemed to find the question troubling, her glance flickering toward the closed music room door with something approaching fear. Alleyn absorbed each nuance with the patience of one who understood that truth emerged not from dramatic confrontation, but from the accumulation of small observations, careful attention to what was said and what remained unspoken. The morning light, growing stronger through Wintermere's tall windows, revealed a household where centuries of careful living had created an atmosphere of profound civility, exactly the sort of environment where murder, when it occurred, would be accomplished with corresponding refinement. Someone among this carefully composed company had transformed sacred silver into an instrument of elegant destruction, had used beauty itself as a weapon, turning the very props of charitable performance into tools of sophisticated death. The killer remained among them, maintaining the same courteous facade that had enabled the crime itself, and Alleyn settled into his investigation with the quiet certainty that patience and observation would eventually penetrate even the most polished deceptions. Alleyn established himself in the library with the instinctive understanding that environment shapes discourse. The room's leather-bound volumes and portraits of scholarly ancestors created an atmosphere that encouraged measured reflection rather than defensive evasion. He positioned himself not behind the imposing desk, but in a wing chair that suggested conversation between equals, though his trained attention missed nothing of the subtle revelations that emerged when people believed themselves to be merely chatting with a courteous gentleman. Lady Wintermere entered first, her composure unshaken by the night's tragedy, though Alleyn detected the slight stiffness in her movements that spoke of strain held carefully in check. She settled into the chair he indicated with practised grace, her pale eyes meeting his with that direct attention which had never failed her in managing both estate and county society. Miss Dacre possessed considerable natural ability, she began without prompting, her voice carrying the measured cadence of one who understood the value of precision. Though she was perhaps more conscious of her gifts than some might consider entirely becoming. One must make allowances for artistic temperament, of course, but Helena could be rather exacting in her expectations of others. The faintest emphasis on the final word suggested depths of meaning that Alleyn filed away for later consideration. She was well regarded by the other members of your company. Helena commanded respect, lady, Wintermere replied with diplomatic accuracy. She had that quality of presence which draws attention, and she was never reluctant to accept the responsibilities such attention brings. Some found her standards rather challenging to meet. When Alleyn inquired about the silver candlesticks, Lady Wintermere's hands remained perfectly still in her lap despite the delicate nature of the subject. The chapel key is kept in the ebony case on the writing table. It is not Fort Knox, Inspector, but we have managed for some generations without incident. Helena insisted on handling the arrangement herself. She said she understood how to achieve the proper effects with such valuable pieces. Felix Marlowe arrived with the slightly theatrical bearing that marked him as a man of the stage, though his obvious distress had stripped away much of his professional polish. His hands showed the faint tremor of someone who had spent a sleepless night replaying scenes that could not be altered. Helena was formidable, he said, settling into his chair with less composure than he might have wished. She possessed that combination of talent and determination, which can be both inspiring and rather overwhelming. Yesterday she seemed more focused than usual, if that were possible. She spent considerable time adjusting the candle's position, ensuring the light would catch her features at precisely the right angle. Did she seem concerned about anything in particular? Felix's laugh held no humour. Helena never worried about her own performances, Inspector. She worried about whether the supporting players would prove adequate to her standards. She had mentioned several times that this evening would be particularly significant for her personally, some sort of culmination, though she didn't elaborate. And the other members of the company, how did they respond to her direction? The hesitation before Felix's answer spoke volumes. Professional jealousy exists even in amateur circles, Inspector, though it rarely extends beyond sharp words or pointed silences. Helena could be quite demanding when others failed to meet her expectations. Sir Julian Thornfield brought his military bearing into the library like colours carried into uncertain territory. His posture remained rigidly correct, but Alleyn detected something defensive in the set of his shoulders. Miss Dacre was a capable actress, Sir Julian stated with parade ground precision. She understood her craft and expected similar competence from others. I found her direct manner refreshing after the usual county circumlocutions. You knew her well outside the theatrical company? A pause, brief but significant. We moved in the same social circles naturally. Helena had strong opinions about various local matters and was not one to remain silent when she felt principles were at stake. She believed in maintaining standards, Inspector, felt that too many people were willing to compromise their values for convenience. You seemed protective of Miss Ashford during rehearsal. Sir Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I am a soldier who has spent too much of his life watching the young meet unfriendly moments. I dislike theatrical ones when they are avoidable. Helena pushed Miss Celia rather hard, and I felt it unnecessary for a charity performance. Young Celia Ashford entered like a wraith, her pale beauty seeming almost translucent in the afternoon light. She perched on the edge of her chair with the delicate precision of a bird prepared for sudden flight, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles showed white. Miss Dacre was very kind to me, she said in a voice barely above a whisper. She took such care to ensure I understood my role, spent extra time helping me with my entrances and exits. And you felt comfortable working with her? Celia's glance flickered toward the closed door as if she feared being overheard. Helena could be quite intense in her dedication. She felt that amateur performances should maintain professional standards, and she was disappointed when others didn't share her commitment. When Alleyn asked about the silver candles, a flush crept up Celia's pale cheeks. She was very particular about them. She moved one herself during the final run-through, to get the angle of a light just right for her entrance. She said the silver would reflect differently than other metals, that she understood how to achieve the best effects with such pieces. You observed her handling the candlestick? Yes, Celia whispered, her eyes widening. She was quite firm about the positioning. She said the light must catch the silver just so to create the proper aura. She seemed to know a great deal about such things. Basil Thorne brought his artist's eye and paint-stained fingers into the library, along with the slightly distracted air of one whose attention remained partially engaged with visual composition. Even during conversation, his hands moved in small, unconscious gestures as if capturing invisible images. Helena was a remarkable subject, he said, with a directness that marked him as more comfortable with visual than verbal communication. She understood the relationship between light and shadow, the way positioning could enhance presence. Yesterday she was particularly concerned with how the candlelight would fall across her costume and veil. You observed her working with the candles closely. She spent considerable time adjusting their height and angle, testing how the flame would illuminate her features. She mentioned that silver reflected light differently than brass or pewter, that these particular candlesticks would provide exactly the quality she required. She seemed quite proprietary about them. Alleyn found this observation particularly interesting. Did she seem familiar with the properties of silver? Thorne's artist's memory proved precise. She spoke of it with considerable knowledge, mentioned that her family had possessed similar pieces. She handled them with the confidence of someone accustomed to valuable objects. Dr. Pell returned to the library with additional medical observations, speaking with the relish of one who appreciated scientific precision. The agent was a cyanide derivative, Inspector, delivered in vapor form when heated. Extremely rapid in action. The victim would have had perhaps seconds of awareness. The method required considerable chemical knowledge and access to specialized substances. How difficult would such materials be to obtain? Dr. Pell's expression grew thoughtful. For a medical professional, not impossible. My own bag contains various compounds that, properly combined and applied, could produce such effects. For others, it would require resourcefulness, perhaps contacts in chemical or pharmaceutical circles. Miss Laffan presented herself with that smooth efficiency which invited careful testing for hidden depths. Her files and precise memory placed people exactly in rooms without once confiding what she thought of them there. Miss Dacre remained after rehearsal, as was her custom, she reported with secretarial precision. Mr. Marlowe initialed a change to the cue sheet regarding candle position, adjusted 6 inches closer to the chair, I locked the chapel at 5:15 and returned the key to its proper place. The candlesticks were handled only by Mr. Quill during transport and Miss Dacre during arrangement. Alleyn noted that she had provided information he hadn't requested while carefully omitting details he had. You observed Miss Dacre's familiarity with the silver pieces? Miss Dacre handled them with considerable expertise, Inspector. She seemed to understand their weight, their balance, their reflective properties. She mentioned having experience with similar ecclesiastical silver from her family's collection. When Alleyn was finally alone in the library's scholarly silence, he reflected on the portrait that had emerged from these careful conversations. Helena Dacre had been a woman of strong opinions and exacting standards, someone who commanded attention and expected deference, who had invested this particular performance with unusual personal significance. Yet beneath the courteous cooperation of his witnesses, he sensed currents of tension that extended far beyond mere artistic differences. Each interview had revealed another facet of Helena's character: her perfectionism, her knowledge of valuable objects, her demanding nature, her proprietary attitude toward the silver candlesticks that had become the instrument of her death. Someone among this carefully composed company had found her standards intolerable, her expectations unbearable, her very presence an obstacle requiring elegant removal. The challenge lay in determining which of these politely cooperative witnesses possessed both the specialized knowledge and the compelling motivation to transform sacred silver into a weapon of sophisticated destruction. The servants' quarters at Windermere possessed that particular quality of ordered efficiency which marked a household where standards had never been permitted to slip. Alleyn found himself in the butler's pantry with Mr. Quill, surrounded by the immaculate evidence of 30 years' devoted service, silver polish arranged with military precision, keys hanging in graduated order, and that indefinable atmosphere of competence which made the smooth operation of great houses appear effortless to those who benefited from it. Quill received him with the composed dignity that had marked his discovery of the tragedy, though Alleyn detected beneath the professional facade a man troubled by details that his training told him were significant. The butler's hands, clasped behind his back in habitual posture, betrayed the slightest tension as he began his careful recounting of the previous day's events. "The silver candlesticks were removed from the chapel at Miss Dacre's specific request, sir," Quill began with measured precision. "She insisted upon supervising their transport personally, though I offered the usual services. She handled them with considerable familiarity, not the hesitation one might expect from someone unaccustomed to such valuable pieces." Alleyn settled into the chair indicated, noting how Quill's trained eye continued its habitual survey of his domain even during conversation. "Did Miss Dacre seem particularly concerned about their condition?" "She was most specific about their preparation, sir. After I positioned them on the dais, she spent considerable time adjusting the nearer candlestick, testing how the light would fall across her entrance. She mentioned that silver reflects differently than other metals, that these particular pieces would provide exactly the quality she required." The butler's pause held significance that Alleyn allowed to develop without prompting. When Quill continued, his voice carried that careful neutrality which marked information he considered both important and delicate. "Miss Dacre produced her own polishing cloth from her handbag, sir, a fine linen square. She was quite particular about cleaning the base of the candlestick herself, mentioning that the chapel dust was rather tenacious. As she worked, she seemed to discover something that required her attention." "Something specific?" Quill's gaze flickered momentarily toward the window before returning to meet Alleyn's eyes. "She produced a small penknife, sir, silver-backed, quite elegant. She used it to scrape delicately at a tiny spot on the candlestick base, as if removing some foreign substance that had adhered to the silver. Then she wiped the area clean with her cloth." This detail struck Alleyn with the force of recognition, though he maintained his expression of polite interest. "Did she seem concerned about what she had found?" "Not concerned, sir. Rather satisfied, as if she had corrected some imperfection that might have marred her performance. She replaced the penknife in her handbag and continued adjusting the candlestick's position with considerable care. Mrs. Bellwether, the housekeeper, received them in her sitting room with the formidable competence that marked her as the true governor of Windermere's domestic realm. Her observations, delivered with diplomatic precision, painted a picture of Helena Dacre as a woman whose standards extended far beyond mere theatrical performance. "Miss Dacre arrived early yesterday afternoon, sir, with her own preparations for the silver. She mentioned that her family had possessed similar ecclesiastical pieces, that she understood the special care they required. She was quite insistent about handling the cleaning herself. Did she seem familiar with chemical preparations? Mrs. Bellwether's hand smoothed her apron with unconscious precision. She spoke with considerable knowledge about achieving proper reflective effect, sir. She had brought a small bottle of what she described as a special preparation for antique silver, something that would enhance its natural properties when exposed to heat. The housekeeper's pause suggested additional information held in reserve. Miss Dacre seemed particularly excited about the evening's performance, sir. She mentioned several times that people would remember her entrance for years to come, that she had planned something quite extraordinary. Young Mary, the second housemaid, provided the final piece of the servant's testimony with the unvarnished directness that more sophisticated witnesses might have considered inappropriate. Her duties had included tidying the music room after rehearsal, and her observations revealed details that others might have overlooked. Miss Dacre was ever so careful with those candles, sir, Mary reported with earnest attention. She wouldn't let anyone else near them once she'd arranged them proper. She kept checking the base of the one candlestick, making sure it was positioned just right for the heat to work on whatever she'd put there. She applied something to the candlestick base, Mary nodded vigorously. Just a tiny bit from her little bottle, sir, worked into the silver where it was thickest. She said the heat from the flame would make it glow something wonderful, that it would be the most beautiful effect anyone had ever seen. When Alleyn had concluded his interviews with the domestic staff, he found himself with a picture that differed significantly from the testimony of the theatrical company. The servants had observed Helena Dacre not merely as a demanding perfectionist, but as a woman engaged in meticulous preparation for what she clearly considered a personal triumph. Her familiarity with the silver candlesticks, her insistence on special cleaning preparations, her excitement about the evening's significance, all suggested someone who believed she was orchestrating her own moment of vindication. Yet the chemical knowledge required for such sophisticated effect seemed to extend far beyond an actress's typical repertoire, however refined her family background might have been. The servant's testimony revealed a woman who had been provided with both the means and the motivation for her final performance, someone who understood that her pride and perfectionism could be channeled into creating what she believed would be her greatest theatrical triumph. The penknife detail particularly intrigued Alleyn. Helena had discovered something on the candlestick base that required removal, yet she had proceeded with her preparations as if this discovery confirmed rather than alarmed her. In the growing shadows of Windermere's domestic quarters, Alleyn contemplated the elegant complexity of a crime that had transformed the victim's own meticulous nature into the instrument of her destruction. Someone had understood Helena's character intimately enough to convince her that she was creating theatrical magic while actually preparing her own death, using her knowledge and pride as weapons against herself. The true murderer remained hidden among the company upstairs, having achieved the perfect crime by persuading Helena to engineer her own demise, while believing she was crafting her most memorable performance. The servants, with their trained discretion and careful observation, had provided the key to understanding how the deception had been accomplished. Now the challenge lay in determining which member of the company possessed both the chemical expertise and the psychological insight necessary to orchestrate such sophisticated manipulation. Alleyn returned to the music room with that particular quality of attention which had served him through decades of investigation, not the dramatic intensity of theatrical detection, but the patient observation of one who understood that truth emerged through the accumulation of small disruptions in the ordinary fabric of life. The silver candlesticks, now extinguished, stood upon their dais with ecclesiastical dignity, yet something in their arrangement spoke of violation disguised as reverence. Mr. Quill appeared at his shoulder with the silent efficiency that had marked his discovery of the tragedy, carrying the small packet of green baize circles that protected Windermere's polished surfaces from the depredations of bare metal. As he positioned the felt pads beneath each candlestick base, Alleyn observed the butler's practiced movements with growing interest. "You always use these protective felts?" "For valuable pieces upon damask, sir, invariably," Quill replied with the quiet pride of one whose standards had never wavered. "Lady Windermere would consider it barbarous to place bare silver upon such fabric. One fears the ghost of a ring." Alleyn's attention sharpened. "And yesterday evening, during the rehearsal?" The slightest hesitation marked Quill's response that minute. pause which spoke of professional distress carefully contained. "One felt was missing, sir, from beneath the right-hand candlestick. I noted its absence after Miss Dacre was discovered and replaced it first thing this morning." The implication settled upon Alleyn with the quiet weight of certainty. Bare silver upon damask would conduct heat more efficiently than felt-cushioned metal, a detail that only someone intimately familiar with both household routine and scientific principle would have understood. The missing felt spoke not of carelessness, but of deliberate preparation, of someone who knew that the smallest details could determine the success of an elegant crime. Examining the candlestick itself under the morning light, Alleyn discovered the evidence that confirmed his growing suspicions. The base, when viewed at the proper angle, revealed faint but unmistakable abrasions, not the smooth marks of careful polishing, but precise shallow scratches concentrated within the area of the dark stain Dr. Pell had identified. These were the marks of Helena's silver-backed penknife, applied with the delicate precision the servants had described, yet serving a purpose far different from what she had believed. The contradiction struck him with crystalline clarity. Helena Dacre, acknowledged expert in the care of valuable silver, meticulous to the point of obsession, had deliberately abraded the surface of a precious ecclesiastical candlestick. Such an action violated every principle of proper conservation, yet the servants had observed her performing it with satisfaction, as if correcting some imperfection that might mar her performance. In the butler's pantry, Mrs. Bellwether's testimony provided the final piece of understanding. Helena had brought her own preparations for the silver, speaking with considerable knowledge about achieving proper reflective effects when exposed to heat. She had mentioned that her family possessed similar pieces, that she understood the special care they required. Yet her actions had been those of someone preparing a surface not for preservation, but for chemical reaction. Young Mary's unvarnished observations completed the picture with devastating clarity. Miss Dacre had applied something from her small bottle to the candlestick base, working it into the silver where the metal was thickest, speaking with excitement about the beautiful effect the heat would create. She had believed she was enhancing the silver's natural properties, creating theatrical magic that would make her entrance unforgettable. The elegant horror of the crime revealed itself through these accumulated details. Someone had understood Helena's character with psychological precision, her pride, her perfectionism, her theatrical vanity, and had used these very strengths to convince her to participate in her own destruction. The scratches she had made with such careful attention had created the perfect surface for chemical absorption. The felt she had unknowingly caused to be removed had ensured optimal heat conduction. The preparation she had applied with such satisfaction had been the instrument of her death. Alleyn stood before the dais, contemplating the sophisticated mind that had orchestrated such manipulation. The killer had achieved the perfect crime not through superior force or cunning, but through intimate knowledge of their victim's psychology. They had provided Helena with both the means and the motivation to engineer her own demise while believing she was creating her masterpiece. The chapel key, found positioned contrary to Miss Laffen's invariable habit, suggested someone who had accessed the sacred space to plant the materials Helena would later discover and use. The empty bottle, concealed behind prayer books with careful deliberation, bore traces of the pharmaceutical preparation that had transformed silver into a conductor of elegant death. In the morning room, Miss Laffen's violet date stamp marked the daily correspondence with its customary precision, yet Alleyn noted how her hand had hesitated over a particular envelope addressed to Mr. Basil Thorne. The letter from a photographic and chemical merchant spoke of professional supplies that could serve purposes far beyond their intended artistic applications. The morning light, filtering through Wintermere's tall windows, illuminated a crime of remarkable sophistication, one that had succeeded not through violence or drama, but through the careful exploitation of human nature itself. Helena Dacre had died believing she was achieving artistic transcendence, never realizing that someone who understood her character better than she understood herself had transformed her greatest strength into her fatal weakness. The stage was now clear, the evidence assembled, and the true nature of the performance slowly revealing itself. Among the carefully composed company upstairs, maintaining their facade of shocked cooperation, sat a killer whose understanding of both chemistry and psychology had enabled them to commit murder through the victim's own unwitting participation. The challenge now lay in determining which member of Wintermere's theatrical company possessed both the technical knowledge and the intimate insight necessary to orchestrate such sophisticated manipulation, using Helena's perfectionism as the very instrument of her destruction. The morning's careful equilibrium began to shift with the subtle persistence of a tide that moves furniture without disturbing the room's essential character. Dr. Pell's return to the library carried with it the clinical satisfaction of one whose professional instincts had been vindicated by more thorough analysis, though his expression suggested discoveries that extended far beyond mere confirmation of initial suspicions. "The chemical preparation was remarkably sophisticated, Inspector," he reported, with that blend of admiration and unease which marked a professional encountering superior expertise in his own field. "Not merely cyanide, but a compound specifically designed to remain stable until activated by heat. More significantly, the concentration and delivery methods suggest someone who understood precisely how Miss Dacre would interact with the materials provided." Alleyn received this information with the quiet attention that had marked his investigation thus far, though something in the doctor's manner suggested revelations yet to be shared. The implications settled upon the room's scholarly atmosphere like frost forming on glass. Someone among Wintermere's company had possessed not merely technical knowledge, but intimate understanding of Helena's character sufficient to orchestrate her participation in her own destruction. It was Miss Lafan who provided the next piece of understanding, appearing in the doorway with that composed urgency which marked her as someone accustomed to managing crises without creating additional drama. Her usually immaculate appearance showed subtle signs of strain, a slight displacement in her habitually perfect arrangement, a tension around her eyes that spoke of discoveries challenging even her considerable capacity for discretion. "Inspector Alleyn," she said with careful modulation, "I believe there is something you should see. In organising Miss Dacre's personal effects, I have encountered certain irregularities that may bear upon your investigation." She led them to her desk in the morning room, where the leather-inlaid surface displayed a collection of documents, arranged with characteristic precision, yet something in their arrangement suggested disturbance beneath the ordered façade. Among Helena's belongings lay correspondence that extended far beyond mere theatrical collaboration. Letters from chemical suppliers, inquiries about pharmaceutical preparations, requests for information about enhancing silver's reflective properties when exposed to heat. Miss Dacre had been conducting extensive research, Alleyn observed, examining the carefully preserved documents. Research suggesting preparation for something far more complex than a charity performance. The letters, dated within the past month, revealed Helena's excitement about pioneering new theatrical techniques. She wrote with the enthusiasm of someone convinced she was breaking artistic ground, describing her intention to create lighting effects that would make her entrance truly revolutionary. Her correspondence with Hartwell and Sons, pharmaceutical chemists in London, showed particular interest in compounds that would enhance silver's natural properties when heated, substances she believed would create theatrical effects of unprecedented beauty. Among Helena's personal effects, Alleyn discovered the crucial evidence that illuminated the crime's elegant mechanics. Folded within her linen handkerchief lay a slip of paper, cut with surgical precision from Wintermere's heavy stationery. The instructions, written in violet ink with meticulous care, read like a ritual disguised as artistic advice. For the Candlemas entrance, bring the base to bright. Scrape to clean silver where tarnish persists. Apply a film of number 7 and place near a stick a handspan forward. Remove one green pad to ensure sufficient warmth. The heat will draw the light. The note bore a single initial, formed with the same precision as the body of text. The violet ink matched Miss Lafan's date stamp exactly, and when Alleyn examined the morning room stationery drawer he found one sheet cut cleanly shorter, the slice too neat for accident. The afternoon brought Celia Ashford's hesitant revelation, delivered in the conservatory among Lady Wintermere's exotic orchids with the trembling honesty of someone who could no longer bear the weight of secret knowledge. Her pale hands twisted a delicate handkerchief as she spoke of Helena's particular attention to her performance. "She was so concerned that I understand the magic of the candle," Celia whispered, her voice barely disturbing the conservatory's humid stillness. "She gave me this tiny vial, Inspector, with clear liquid. She said it would make the silver gleam, make my performance unforgettable. She made me promise to apply it to the candlestick base just before my cue to enhance her entrance." The vial she produced from her pocket contained the same crystalline preparation Dr. Pell had identified on the fatal candlestick, though Celia's terror at her near participation in the crime was evident in every trembling gesture. "I never used it, Inspector. I was too frightened. But she made me promise. And now—" Dr. Pell's examination of the vial confirmed its lethal concentration, far exceeding any safe theatrical application. Someone had provided Helena with materials that appeared to serve her artistic purposes while ensuring her destruction, using her own research and enthusiasm as weapons against her. The day's final disturbance came with the discovery that Dr. Pell's medical bag had been quietly rifled, the small bottle containing residue from the fatal preparation removed with surgical precision. The theft occurred during a brief absence when he attended to Celia's earlier faintness, and only the faint scent of bitter almonds lingering in the blue anteroom betrayed the intruder's presence. "Someone anticipated the need to reclaim evidence," Alleyn observed, examining the violated medical case. "Someone who understood that chemical analysis would reveal more than they wished discovered." The theft demonstrated the killer's continued presence among them, their willingness to take calculated risks to protect their elegant deception. Yet in the very audacity of the act lay confession. Only someone with intimate knowledge of the household's rhythms could have anticipated Dr. Pell's movements so precisely. As evening approached, the accumulated revelations settled over Windermere House like a gathering storm that threatened without yet breaking. The carefully maintained social fabric showed subtle signs of strain, conversations that ended too abruptly when Alleyn appeared, glances that lingered too long on the closed music room door, the way hands sought familiar objects for comfort against growing unease. Helena Dacre had died believing she was achieving artistic transcendence, never realizing that someone who understood her character better than she understood herself had transformed her greatest strength into her fatal weakness. The killer remained among them, maintaining their facade of shocked cooperation while demonstrating a psychological sophistication that matched their chemical expertise. In the growing shadows of Windermere's elegant rooms, Alleyn contemplated a crime that had succeeded through perfect understanding of human nature. A murder accomplished not through force or cunning, but through the careful exploitation of the victim's own ambitions and expertise. The challenge now lay in determining which member of the company possessed both the technical knowledge and the intimate insight necessary to orchestrate such sophisticated manipulation, using Helena's perfectionism as the very instrument of her destruction. The second stirring had revealed the killer's continued presence and ongoing vigilance, their willingness to act decisively when circumstances demanded. Yet in these very actions lay the threads that would eventually unravel their carefully constructed deception, for even the most elegant crime left traces for those who knew how to read the subtle language of guilt disguised as grief. The afternoon light possessed that particular quality of English winter illumination which seemed to distill rather than merely brighten, casting everything into sharp relief while somehow deepening the shadows that gathered in the corners of understanding. Alleyn found himself in the small study overlooking Windermere's formal gardens, allowing the day's accumulated observations to settle with the patience that had never failed him in complex cases. He had learned long ago that truth emerged not through strenuous intellectual wrestling, but through the quiet arrangement of facts until the pattern revealed itself with almost inevitable grace. The psychological portrait that had emerged possessed the terrible symmetry of classical tragedy, where character becomes destiny and strength transforms inexorably into weakness. Helena Dacre had died not as the victim of random violence, but as the unwitting architect of her own destruction, manipulated with surgical precision by someone who understood her nature better than she had understood herself. The elegance of the crime lay not in its execution, but in its conception. Murder accomplished through the victim's enthusiastic cooperation, death disguised as theatrical triumph. The violet-inked note represented the masterpiece of psychological manipulation, each instruction, crafted with intimate knowledge of Helena's desires and weaknesses. Bring the base to bright, appealing directly to her perfectionism. Scrape to clean silver where tarnish persists, legitimizing the abrasion that would create the perfect surface for chemical absorption. Apply a film of number 7, providing the lethal agent disguised as artistic enhancement. Remove one green pad to ensure sufficient warmth, the crucial detail that would ensure optimal heat conduction, transformed into mystical stagecraft with the phrase "the heat will draw the light." Alleyn contemplated the chess-like precision with which the crime had been orchestrated. The killer had understood that Helena's meticulous nature would ensure perfect execution of their deadly ritual, that her pride would prevent her from seeking assistance, and that her theatrical training would make her treasure the secrecy surrounding her supposed innovation. They had provided research materials that seemed to serve her artistic purposes, correspondence that fed her excitement about pioneering new techniques, and finally the fatal preparation itself, all while convincing her she was achieving theatrical transcendence. He walked once more through his assessment of the company, allowing each character to reveal its essential nature through the accumulated weight of observation. Lady Windermere possessed the intellect and authority, but her power was overt rather than covert, her methods direct rather than serpentine. Felix Marlowe understood theatrical vanity and possessed professional motives, yet his distress seemed genuine, and the intricate chemical knowledge required did not align with his artistic temperament. Sir Julian's military precision and protective instincts towards Celia spoke of principled frustration rather than calculated malice. He was made for straight roads, not labyrinthine deceptions. Young Celia herself had been positioned as the perfect secondary victim, given the vial of poison she was too frightened to use, her terror serving as both alibi and evidence of the killer's psychological sophistication. Basil Thorne's artistic sensibility might appreciate the crime's elegance, but the scientific precision and psychological manipulation seemed beyond his usual realm of surfaces and light. The theft of evidence from Dr. Pell's medical bag revealed the killer's continued presence and ongoing vigilance, their willingness to take calculated risks when circumstances demanded. Yet this very audacity provided its own illumination. Only someone with intimate knowledge of Windermere's rhythms could have anticipated the doctor's movements with such precision. Only someone familiar with the household's patterns could have acted with such confident timing. The psychological profile that crystallized pointed towards someone whose expertise extended beyond mere chemical knowledge to encompass a profound understanding of human nature itself. They possessed the technical skill to create compounds that remained stable until activated by specific conditions, the administrative competence to manage Helena's research correspondence, and the cold calculation necessary to transform those very ambitions into weapons of destruction. The conservatory's humid atmosphere seemed to concentrate thought as Alleyn considered the accumulated evidence. Miss Lafan's role in the household's daily operations, her access to correspondence and stationery, her knowledge of everyone's movements and habits, her ability to provide Helena with research contacts while maintaining the invisible efficiency that marked superior secretarial service, the violet ink that matched her date stamp, the precisely cut stationery, the careful timing of evidence placement. Each detail spoke of someone whose professional competence extended far beyond mere clerical duties. Yet the true revelation lay not in technical capability, but in psychological insight. The killer had invested enormous effort in ensuring Helena's participation in her own destruction, creating an elaborate fiction that allowed the victim to believe she was achieving artistic triumph, even as she prepared her own death. Such sophisticated deception spoke of deep personal investment, of grievances that demanded not merely Helena's death, but her complete humiliation through unwitting complicity. As the winter light began to fade beyond Windermere's tall windows, Alleyn's intuitions settled like dust on ancient furniture, quiet and pervasive. The killer remained among the carefully composed company, maintaining their facade of shocked grief while demonstrating a psychological sophistication that matched their chemical expertise. The challenge now lay not in identifying the method, or even the perpetrator, but in understanding the profound personal motivations that had driven someone to invest such elaborate effort in ensuring not merely Helena's death, but her complete deception. In the growing shadows of Windermere's elegant rooms, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of sophisticated manipulation and psychological insight, Alleyn prepared for the delicate task of unravelling secrets that had festered beneath the polished surface of county society. The killer's identity was settling into certainty, but the full revelation of their motivations would require the careful exposure of grievances that had transformed professional competence into an instrument of elegant destruction, using Helena's own perfectionism as the very mechanism of her doom. The small study overlooking Windermere's formal gardens possessed that quality of scholarly intimacy which encouraged confidential discourse, its leather-bound volumes and winter light, creating an atmosphere where truth might emerge through conversation rather than confrontation. Alleyn had chosen this setting with deliberate care, understanding that Miss Laffan's particular nature would respond better to privacy than to the theatrical exposure of a drawing-room revelation. When she entered at his quiet request, carrying the household correspondence with her customary efficiency, something in her manner suggested she had been expecting this moment with the resigned patience of one who understood that all careful arrangements must eventually reach their conclusion. She positioned herself with characteristic precision beside the writing desk, her notebook ready despite the unofficial nature of their meeting, though Alleyn observed how her usually steady hands showed the faintest tremor as she prepared for whatever revelations the afternoon might bring. The winter light, filtering through tall panes, cast everything into sharp relief, while somehow deepening the shadows that gathered in the corners of understanding. "You have been remarkably helpful throughout this investigation," Alleyn began with the courtesy that had never failed him in such circumstances, his tone carrying neither accusation nor judgment, merely the quiet acknowledgement of professional competence. "Your organisation of Miss Dacre's correspondence, your knowledge of household routines, your attention to detail, all have been invaluable in understanding the complex circumstances surrounding her death." Miss Laffan inclined her head with the same measured grace she brought to all aspects of her duties, though something in her pale eyes suggested she recognised the careful precision with which he had chosen his words. "I have endeavoured to provide whatever assistance might prove useful, Inspector. Miss Dacre's death represents a considerable disruption to Lady Windermere's household, and I felt it important to ensure that all relevant information was properly preserved." The response carried her customary secretarial efficiency, yet Alleyn detected beneath the professional facade a quality of watchful attention that spoke of someone calculating the implications of every exchange. He moved to the window, allowing the conversation to develop with the natural rhythm that had served him well in similar circumstances. "The violet ink used in your daily correspondence," he observed with seemingly casual interest, "is quite distinctive. Dr. Pell mentioned you recommended it to Lady Windermere when the black ran in damp weather, a practical solution to a persistent problem." "The violet is indelible," she replied with quiet precision. "It maintains its clarity regardless of postal conditions. I felt it would serve Lady Windermere's extensive correspondence more reliably than conventional inks." Alleyn nodded, his attention drawn to the writing desk where the morning's letters lay arranged with mathematical exactness. Among them, he noted the small slip of paper he had discovered folded within Helena's handkerchief, the instructions that had guided her through the ritual of her own destruction. The violet word seemed to pulse with significance in the afternoon light. "The note found among Miss Dacre's effects," he continued, with the same measured precision, demonstrates remarkable understanding of both her character and her ambitions. The language appeals directly to her perfectionism, bring the base to bright, scrape to clean silver where tarnish persists. These are the phrases of someone who understood how to motivate her through her deepest desires. Miss Laffan's gaze flickered momentarily toward the incriminating slip, before returning to meet his eyes with something approaching recognition. Miss Dacre was indeed meticulous in her preparations. She required detailed guidance to achieve the effects she envisioned. The stationery, Alleyn observed, producing the paper knife from the desk drawer with deliberate care, was cut with surgical precision, the edges too clean for tearing, too straight for casual use. Someone with access to Lady Windermere's personal writing materials took considerable care in its preparation. The silence that followed carried the weight of accumulating evidence, each detail adding to the portrait of sophisticated premeditation that had emerged throughout his investigation. Miss Laffan maintained her composed facade, yet Alleyn detected the subtle signs of strain that marked someone whose careful arrangements were being methodically exposed. "The correspondence with Hartwell and Sons reveals fascinating attention to detail," he continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the gravity of his implications. Miss Dacre's research into heat-reactive compounds, her inquiries about enhancing silver's reflective properties, all managed with remarkable efficiency through the estate office, the postal arrangements, the forwarding of materials, the careful coordination of her theatrical ambitions with the necessary chemical supplies. Miss Laffan's hands, folded in her lap with habitual precision, showed the faintest tightening that spoke of tension carefully contained. Miss Dacre was most particular about her research, She felt that amateur performances should maintain professional standards, and she was determined to achieve effects that would distinguish her work from mere county theatricals. The missing felt pad, Alleyn noted with quiet significance, required intimate knowledge of Mr. Quill's invariable habits. Someone who understood that valuable silver is never placed directly upon damask, who knew that the green baize circles are as essential to proper household management as the silver itself. At this, Miss Laffen's composure showed its first genuine crack, a slight drawing together of her eyebrows that suggested the recognition of evidence she had hoped might remain unnoticed. Mr. Quill is painstaking in his duties. He would blame himself for any oversight, however minor. Yet the oversight was deliberate, Alleyn observed with gentle precision. Someone removed that felt pad knowing exactly how its absence would affect heat conduction, understanding that bare silver upon fabric would create the precise conditions necessary for their chemical preparation to achieve its intended effect. The afternoon light continued to fade beyond the study's windows, casting the room into that particular quality of English twilight, which seemed to encourage both revelation and concealment in equal measure. Miss Laffan sat with increasing stillness, her professional training asserting itself even as the careful structure of her deception began to reveal its elegant architecture. The theft from Dr. Pell's medical bag, Alleyn continued with the same measured precision, demonstrated remarkable knowledge of his habits. Someone who knew he invariably leaves his case in the blue anteroom, who understood his routines well enough to act with perfect timing. Miss Laffen's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the same controlled competence that had marked her service throughout a decade of social seasons. Dr. Pell has attended Lady Windermere's family for 20 years. His habits are well established, his preferences accommodated as a matter of course. The motivation, Alleyn said with quiet understanding, required more than mere chemical knowledge or administrative competence. Someone invested enormous effort in ensuring not merely Miss Dacre's death, but her complete participation in her own destruction. Such sophisticated manipulation speaks of profound personal grievance, of wounds that festered beneath the polished surface of professional courtesy. At this, Miss Laffan raised her eyes to meet his with something approaching relief, as if the burden of maintaining her careful facade had finally become too complex for solitary management. When she spoke, her voice carried a quality of confession that had been absent from all her previous responses. Miss Dacre possessed remarkable confidence in her own judgment, she said, with the quiet authority of one who had observed that confidence at close range for many years. She believed herself capable of achieving effects that others might consider impossible, and she was never one to question her own abilities when presented with opportunities that seemed to confirm her exceptional nature. The admission, delivered with secretarial precision, carried within it the acknowledgement that Alleyn had been seeking. In the growing shadows of Windermere's study, surrounded by the scholarly furniture of centuries of civilized discourse, the truth began to emerge with the inevitable grace that marked all properly conducted revelations. She would have died believing she was achieving artistic transcendence, Alleyn observed, with something approaching compassion, never realizing that someone had transformed her greatest strengths into the instruments of her doom. Miss Laffen's composure remained intact, but something in her manner suggested the profound relief of one who had carried a burden too complex for solitary management, and who found in Alleyn's understanding the first possibility of laying that burden down. The private confrontation had achieved its purpose without theatrics or dramatic collapse, merely the quiet recognition that truth, once properly assembled, possessed its own inexorable authority. The drawing-room at Windermere possessed that quality of ceremonial gravity which had witnessed 3 centuries of family councils, its proportions lending dignity even to the most difficult revelations. Lady Windermere occupied her customary chair beneath the portrait of the first baronet, her composure unshaken despite the night's accumulated strain. Sir Julian stood with military precision near the mantelpiece, while Felix Marlowe had positioned himself with the careful attention of one who understood that some performances required perfect stillness. Dr. Pell maintained his professional reserve beside the writing table, and young Celia Ashford sat pale but composed, her hands folded with unconscious mimicry of her aunt's dignified bearing. Mr. Quill appeared at the threshold with his customary discretion, not precisely included yet unable to be absent, his presence the final assurance that proper form would be maintained regardless of circumstances. Miss Laffan entered last at Alleyn's quiet request, taking her accustomed position slightly apart from the family circle, as if to preserve the line she had always maintained between service and intimacy. Alleyn did not presume the centre of the room but remained beside the writing table, his hands resting lightly upon its polished surface. When he spoke, it was with the measured courtesy of one who understood that truth, properly presented, possessed its own inexorable authority without requiring theatrical emphasis. The death of Miss Helena Dacre, he began with quiet precision, was accomplished through the transformation of her greatest strengths into the instruments of her destruction. Someone understood her character with remarkable intimacy, her perfectionism, her theatrical vanity, her unshakable confidence in her own judgment, and used these very qualities to convince her to orchestrate her own demise while believing she was achieving artistic transcendence. He lifted from the blotter the small rectangle of violet-inked paper that had guided Helena through her final performance. This note demonstrates psychological manipulation of extraordinary sophistication. Each instruction was crafted to appeal directly to Miss Dacre's desires, while serving a purpose far different from what she believed. Bring the base to bright, legitimizing the abrasion that would create perfect surface conditions for chemical absorption. Remove one green pad to ensure sufficient warmth, eliminating the felt barrier that would have prevented optimal heat conduction. The assembled company received these revelations with the controlled attention that marked their breeding, though Alleyn detected the subtle signs of growing comprehension in the tightening around eyes, the careful stillness of hands that sought familiar objects for comfort. The stationery, he continued with the same measured precision, was cut with surgical accuracy from Lady Windermere's personal writing materials. The violet ink matches exactly that used for daily correspondence, indelible and distinctive. The knowledge of household routines, Mr. Quill's invariable use of felt pads beneath valuable silver, Dr. Pell's customary habits, the precise timing of everyone's movements, all point to someone whose professional competence extended far beyond mere clerical duties. Miss Laffan maintained her composed facade throughout these revelations, her hands folded in her lap with characteristic precision, though something in her pale eyes suggested the profound relief of one whose careful arrangements were finally receiving proper recognition. When Alleyn's gaze settled upon her with quiet certainty, she met it without flinching. The correspondence with Hartwell and Sons, Alleyn observed, was managed with remarkable efficiency through the estate office. Miss Dacre's research into heat-reactive compounds, her excitement about creating unprecedented theatrical effects, all facilitated by someone who understood how to transform genuine artistic ambition into unwitting participation in murder. Lady Windermere's voice, when she spoke, carried 10 years of trust, carefully modulated by growing understanding. Miss Laffan, Inspector Alleyn appears to have drawn certain conclusions. I should like to hear what you have to say. Miss Laffan's response possessed that quality of professional competence she brought to all complex arrangements. She did not protest or dissemble, but addressed Lady Windermere with the same respectful directness that had marked a decade of devoted service. "Ma'am," she said with quiet dignity, "Inspector Alleyn's observations are entirely accurate. Miss Dacre was led to believe she would achieve effects no one had previously witnessed. She died convinced she was creating the most beautiful theatrical moment of her career." The admission fell into the room's careful silence with the weight of absolute truth. Felix Marlowe released a breath he had been unconsciously holding, while Sir Julian's military bearing stiffened imperceptibly. Dr. Pell maintained his professional reserve, though his eyes reflected the clinical interest of one who appreciated sophisticated methodology. The motivation, Alleyn continued with gentle encouragement, required more than mere technical expertise. Someone invested enormous effort in ensuring not merely Miss Dacre's death, but her complete psychological manipulation. Such sophisticated deception speaks of profound personal grievance. Miss Laffan's composure remained intact as she provided the explanation that had festered beneath her professional facade for months. "Miss Dacre had discovered certain irregularities in my management of household accounts," she said, with the precision of one who had rehearsed this confession many times. "Small amounts, carefully economized to meet obligations from my late husband's medical expenses. She felt it her duty to expose what she termed domestic dishonesty, unless I confessed within the week." The revelation illuminated the personal stakes that had driven such elaborate revenge, yet Miss Laffan continued with additional layers of motivation that spoke to deeper grievances. "More significantly," she added with quiet bitterness, Miss Dacre had learned of the late master's wartime sacrifice, the chapel silver sold to fund the village hospital. She spoke with considerable enthusiasm about revealing this in her speech of thanks, as an irony to charm London company and stir subscriptions to her own projects. She would have made squalid what was done from necessity, and blessed by the bishop himself. Lady Windermere's face showed the hairline crack of one whose deepest principles had been threatened, though her voice remained steady. My son did what honour required. Miss Dacre would have had no right to make it a matter of public entertainment. Just so, ma'am, Miss Laffan replied, with the satisfaction of one whose actions had been properly understood. She possessed remarkable confidence in her ability to manage other people's affairs, to expose their private sacrifices for her own theatrical purposes. She was not wicked, merely careless with other lives. The psychological sophistication of the crime revealed itself through these careful admissions. Miss Laffan had understood that Helena's character made her uniquely vulnerable to manipulation disguised as artistic collaboration, that her perfectionism could be channeled into creating the precise conditions necessary for elegant murder. My late husband was a pharmaceutical chemist, she continued with professional precision. The knowledge proved applicable to Miss Dacre's research requirements. The compound she applied so carefully to the candlestick base was precisely what she believed, a preparation to enhance silver's reflective properties when heated. The additional component that transformed it from theatrical aid to lethal agent was my own contribution to her artistic vision. In the growing shadows of Windermere's drawing room, surrounded by the accumulated dignity of centuries of civilized discourse, the truth had emerged with the inevitable grace that marked all properly conducted revelations. Miss Laffan had confessed to murder accomplished through perfect psychological understanding, using Helena's own character as the weapon of her destruction. There was no outcry, no dramatic collapse, only the quiet acceptance that something irreparable had been done with a scrupulousness that eliminated any defence of accident or passion. The assembled company sat in the profound silence of those who had witnessed the exposure of secrets that had festered beneath the polished surface of their carefully ordered world. Miss Laffan rose with the same composed dignity that had marked her service throughout a decade of social seasons. "Inspector," she said with the courtesy she brought to all official arrangements, "I understand there are formalities to be observed." Alleyn nodded with the respect due to someone whose crime, however terrible, had been executed with remarkable sophistication. "Miss Laffan, I shall arrange for transport presently. If there is correspondence you wish to complete, you may use the writing table." She moved to her accustomed place with characteristic precision, lifted her pen, and began to write with the same violet ink that had guided Helena Dacre through her final, unwitting performance. The line flowed across the pale paper with unshaken clarity, marking the conclusion of a crime that had transformed the very virtues of service and competence into instruments of elegant destruction. The arrangements proceeded with that particular quality of English discretion which transforms even the most dramatic circumstances into matters of proper procedure. Miss Laffan completed her final correspondence with the same meticulous attention she had brought to a decade of household management, her violet ink flowing across Lady Windermere's stationery with unshaken precision. When she rose from the writing table, she had left comprehensive instructions for the management of pending social obligations, the location of household keys requiring redistribution, and reminders about the bishop's dietary preferences for his Christmas visit. Lady Windermere received this final demonstration of competence with the composure that had carried her through 3 decades of social leadership, though something in her pale eyes suggested the profound disorientation of one whose trust had been both betrayed and vindicated in equal measure. "Thank you, Miss Laffan," she said with quiet dignity. "Your arrangements have always been exemplary." The exchange possessed that quality of surreal courtesy which marked English society's response to circumstances that challenged conventional understanding, maintaining the forms of proper behaviour even as the foundations of their carefully ordered world shifted beneath them. When the constables arrived from the village, they found Miss Laffan ready with her travelling costume and single valise, packed with characteristic efficiency. She had changed into a severe but well-tailored ensemble that suggested someone prepared for a journey whose duration remained uncertain. As she walked between the officers with the same measured pace she had brought to all her movements at Windermere, her dignity remained undiminished by circumstances that would have reduced others to theatrical displays of distress. The motorcar's departure down Windermere's frost-touched drive marked not merely the removal of a criminal, but the quiet conclusion of a decade of devoted service transformed into sophisticated vengeance. The assembled company began the delicate process of absorbing revelations that challenged their understanding of both human nature and social order, their shock contained within the bounds of well-bred restraint. Dr. Pell, observing the proceedings with clinical interest, found himself compelled to acknowledge the remarkable methodology that had enabled such elegant crime. The psychological manipulation was extraordinary, he murmured to Alleyn. To convince someone to orchestrate their own destruction, while believing they were achieving artistic transcendence, it represents murder that transcends mere physical violence. Sir Julian's military training provided a different framework for understanding. She conducted a campaign, he observed with grudging professional respect. Superior strategy rather than superior force, quite brilliant in its terrible way. The charitable performance was quietly cancelled, the funds raised through alternative means that avoided any association with theatrical endeavour. Helena Dacre was buried with appropriate ceremony in the village churchyard, her grave marked by a simple stone that made no reference to the theatrical ambitions that had proved her undoing. Felix Marlowe returned to London within a fortnight, taking up a position that promised steadier temperaments and better fees. The silver candlesticks resumed their ecclesiastical dignity in Windermere's chapel, where Mr. Quill would light them on holy days with measured reverence, their flames steadying themselves without curiosity about their temporary elevation to theatrical service. The music room recovered its proportions, the gilt chair returning to its routine of elderly ladies' visits at tea, the damask skirting restored to its proper place in the linen press that had always smelled faintly of lavender. Miss Lafan's trial, conducted with the dignity that marked English justice at its most ceremonial, revealed the full sophistication of her crime, while maintaining the courteous forms that preserve social order, even in the face of murder most elegant. Her confession, delivered with the same professional competence she had brought to household management, acknowledged both the technical brilliance and the moral horror of her achievement. The verdict surprised no one who had followed the proceedings, and she received her sentence with the same composed dignity she had brought to all her arrangements, disappearing into the machinery of justice with efficient discretion. Alleyn, reflecting on the case in the quiet of his London study, found himself contemplating the terrible sophistication of a crime that had succeeded through perfect understanding of human nature itself. Miss Lafan had committed murder not through passion or greed, but through the careful exploitation of character, transforming her victims' greatest strengths into the instruments of destruction. She had understood that Helena's perfectionism could be channeled into self-destruction, had recognized that theatrical vanity could serve as the very mechanism of death. The psychological architecture of the crime continued to occupy his thoughts. The way human nature, twisted by grievance and wounded pride, could weave such an elaborate tapestry of deception. Miss Lafan's motivations had extended beyond mere fear of exposure for her small embezzlements to encompass a deeper violation. Helena's threatened desecration of the family's wartime sacrifice, her intention to transform private honour into public entertainment for her own theatrical purposes. In the growing shadows of his study, Alleyn contemplated the elegant horror of what had been accomplished. Someone whose life had been one of quiet service and hidden burdens had fashioned a revenge that was equally quiet, equally hidden, and ultimately devastating. She had used Helena's own character, her ambition, her perfectionism, her unshakable confidence in her own judgment, as the very instruments of her destruction, a form of poetic justice that was both sophisticated and deeply personal. Heat draws light, he reflected, remembering the fatal instruction Helena had followed so carefully. Habit draws truth, and what people believe about themselves draws them out into the world where their acts become legible. It was not a consoling thought, but it possessed the advantage of accuracy. The silver candles would burn again in Windermere's chapel, their flames steady and pure, their ecclesiastical purpose restored. Yet those who had witnessed their temporary transformation would forever associate their light with the memory of Helena Dacre's final performance and the terrible sophistication of the woman who had convinced her that she was creating beauty while actually orchestrating her own elegant destruction. The case closed not with triumph, but with that quiet recognition which marked the end of all properly conducted investigations, the acknowledgement that truth, once assembled with sufficient patience and observation, possessed its own inexorable authority. In the ordered silence of Wintermere House, life resumed its careful patterns, though beneath the polished surface of county society, the memory lingered of how easily competence could be corrupted into vengeance, and how the quietest souls could conceive the most intricately cruel designs.